Snow drove sideways through the pines as a lone figure in a snow-caked brown shawl struggled deeper into the Silvercrest range, the trail behind her already erased. She stopped when the storm parted for an instant and revealed a shape among the trees that had corners no boulder ever wore. Half buried in drift stood an old freighter's wagon, its box grown over the years into a low timber cabin no map had ever marked. Her frozen hand lifted the iron latch, and the door groaned inward on a room that had waited in darkness longer than she had been alive. Inside, above a cold cast-iron stove, words lay carved deep into the timber by some patient hand long stilled. Kneeling to read them, she pressed her palm to a bench that answered with the hollow knock of empty space behind the wood. A shallow drawer slid free, and dust rose gold in the firelight around a bundle of letters bound in faded cloth. She unfolded the topmost page, and the date written across the top was the 14th of October, the same lonely birthday she had carried her whole life. On the morning she turned 21, Winifred Sutton woke to a cold stove, and the certainty that if she never came down from the mountains, the town of Red Willow would go on exactly as it always had, and not one soul would think to ask where she had gone. The thought did not arrive as bitterness. Bitterness required a person to believe things ought to have been otherwise. And Winnie had given up that belief somewhere around her 14th year. It came instead as a plain accounting, the way a shopkeeper tallies a column of figures and arrives at a sum he already expected. 21 years of living, and the only person who would mark the date was herself, lying beneath a thin quilt in a rented attic room above the laundry, watching her breath rise white toward the rafters. Frost had drawn its ferns across the little window in the night. She lay still a moment longer than she should have, listening to the boarding house wake around her, the thud of Widow Ackerley's heels on the stair below. The clank of the wash kettle dragged across the floor of the room where Winnie earned her keep. October in the Montana Territory did not ease into winter so much as ambush it, and this morning the air carried the hard, clean smell that meant snow was gathering somewhere up in the high country, patient as a creditor. She pushed back the quilt, set her bare feet on the cold planks, and got on with the business of being alive, because that was the only birthday gift she had ever learned to expect. She dressed by feel in the gray light, wool stockings first, then the brown calico with the mended elbow, then the shawl her fingers knew every knot and thinness of. She had made most of what she wore. That was the one true skill the years had pressed into her. Needle and thread, the patient joining of things that had come apart. And in Red Willow it kept a roof over her head and a plate before her, if not much else. Downstairs the Wisso set a bowl of cornmeal mush in front of her without a word, the same as any morning. And Winnie ate it standing near the stove, because standing near the stove was the only warmth the arrangement afforded. She did not say what day it was. There was no one to say it to who would have thought the news worth the breath. You learn, when no one is waiting for you, to move through the world quietly so as not to remind it that you are there. Winnie had learned it young. She had been left, so the county record ran, on the steps of a mission house in a hard winter. A scrap of a thing wrapped in a flour sack, with a name pinned to the wool that might have been hers, or might have been the name of whoever had done the wrapping. Sutton. It was all she had of the beginning of her own story, 6 letters and no face to hang them on. From there she had passed from hand to hand the way a coin passes, spent and pocketed and spent again. A farm family here who needed help with the churning, a preacher's wife there who wanted a girl to mind the little ones, and found this one too solemn for her liking. Some had been kind in the careless way of people who mean well and forget you the moment you leave the room. Most had simply needed the work of her hands and had no use for the rest of her. By the time she came to Red Willow at 17, riding in the back of a freight wagon with everything she owned in a carpet bag, she had made a private peace with the shape of her life. She would work. She would keep herself. She would not reach for anyone, because reaching had only ever taught her how far the empty air extended. That morning she had mending to deliver to the mercantile 3 shirts and a torn quilt belonging to the storekeeper's wife. and she wrapped them in brown paper and stepped out into a street the color of old pewter. Red Willow was not much of a town and never pretended otherwise. A single rutted thoroughfare with the mercantile at one end and the assay office at the other. A livery, a church, a saloon that doubled as the meeting hall when the territory needed one. Beyond the last building, the land fell away into rolling grass, gone tawny with the season. And past the grass rose the Silvercrest Range, blue and cold and enormous, its highest shoulders already gone white. Winnie had lived in the shadow of those mountains for 4 years, without once walking into them. They frightened most people, and most people were right to be frightened, but they had always drawn her the way. Deep water draws a swimmer who has forgotten how to fear it. At the mercantile, she set her bundle on the counter and waited while Hollis Barnes counted out her coins. And it was there, standing near the barrel of pickled goods with the smell of coal oil and dry goods thick in her nose, that she first heard the name she would come to know so well, though she did not know it yet. 2 men stood by the stove at the back of the store. One of them was a stranger, a lean, well-dressed figure in a town coat that had never known real work, with a way of leaning that suggested he was used to rooms arranging themselves around him. He was asking Barnes about land, about old claims, he said, the abandoned ones, the ones filed decades back and never proved up, the ones whose owners had died or drifted off, and left the paper to gather dust in the county books. There's parcels up in that range, the stranger was saying, tapping the counter with one gloved finger, that a man could acquire for the back taxes alone, if he knew which ones and knew how to move quick. The government's got no love for empty ground. Neither have I. Barnes said something non-committal, the way a careful man does with a stranger who talks of quick money, and the lean man laughed a laugh that did not climb as high as his eyes. Silas Thorne, he named himself, offering it the way some men offer a business card, as though the name itself were a thing of value. Winnie gathered her coins and left, and she thought no more of him then than she would have of any drummer passing through, except that something in the way he had said empty ground snagged on her like a burr, as though land could be empty, as though a place where people had once lived and worked and hoped could be nothing but a line in a ledger, waiting to be crossed out. She spent the rest of the morning at the small jobs that filled her days, and all the while the sky went on, lowering itself over the valley, the clouds sliding down off the peaks like something spilled. By noon, the first restless gusts were coming through town, snatching at the loose shingles, driving the chickens under the church steps. Anyone with sense stayed close to a stove on a day like that. But Winnie, standing in the doorway of the laundry with the storm coming on and her 21st year begun in silence, felt the old pull toward the high country sharpen into something almost like hunger. There was a practical reason, or she told herself there was. A trapper named Ostrander had left word he would pay for a set of heavy gloves and a lined coat mended before the deep cold set in, and his cabin sat at the base of the range where the foothills began, a long walk out of town along the creek. She could carry the work to him, collect the coin, and be back before dark if she stepped lively. That was the reason she gave the widow. And the widow, who had troubles enough of her own, only shrugged and told her not to be a fool about the weather. But Winnie knew, lacing her boots tight and packing the mended coat into her satchel, alongside a heel of bread and a tin flask of coffee gone lukewarm, that the trapper's coin was the smallest part of it. The larger part was that on the one day of the year that ought to have belonged to her, she wanted to be somewhere the emptiness was honest. The mountains never pretended to want you. There was a kind of relief in that, after a life spent among people who pretended. She set out along the creek road with the wind pushing at her back, and for the first hour the walk was only bracing, the cold clean in her lungs, the grass hissing and bowing all around her. The trapper's cabin, when she reached it, stood shuttered and cold, a note tacked to the door in a crabbed hand saying he had gone up to check his lines and would be back by nightfall. Winnie stood there with the mended coat in her hands and the first fat flakes beginning to spin down out of the gray, and she knew the sensible thing was to leave the work on his step and turn straight around for town. She did not do the sensible thing. She could never afterward fully explain why. Perhaps it was the birthday, and the wanting of 1 hour that felt like her own. Perhaps it was only that the trail beyond the trapper's cabin climbed up into a stand of pines she had looked at from a distance for 4 years, and never once entered. And today, with no one waiting and nothing to lose, the wanting to see what lay past that tree line had grown larger than her caution. She left the coat on the step, wrapped against the wet in its brown paper, and she climbed. The snow was falling in earnest by the time she gained the pines, no longer the pretty drifting flakes of the open ground, but a thickening curtain that hushed the world and swallowed distance. Winnie had meant to walk only a little way, just far enough to stand among the great trunks and look back down at the valley she had never seen from above. But the valley was already gone, wiped out behind her by the white, and when she turned to find the trail she had come up by, the forest had rearranged itself in the way forests do in snow, every gap between the trees suddenly identical, every fallen log wearing the same soft blanket. She was not frightened yet. She told herself she was not frightened. She had only to go downhill, and downhill would bring her to the creek, and the creek would bring her home. But the ground did not slope the way she remembered. She walked what she was certain was down and found herself climbing. She corrected, and the correction led her into a ravine that pinched shut against a wall of rock she had never seen. The snow came harder now, driven sideways by a wind with teeth in it, and the daylight, what little the storm allowed, thinned toward the gray of late afternoon, far too soon. Somewhere in the space of an hour, without any single moment she could point to, Winnie had crossed the line from a woman, taking a walk into a woman who was lost, and the mountain, which had never pretended to want her, now seemed to want her gone. She stopped in the lee of a boulder and made herself be still. Panic was the thing that killed people in the high country. She had read it in the almanacs and heard it from the old teamsters who wintered in Red Willow, that it was never the cold alone that took a person, but the fear that set them running in circles until the cold could catch them. So she stood, breathing slow, brushing the snow from her lashes, and she made herself think. She had her satchel, her flask, the heel of bread. She had a small clasp knife and, folded in a scrap of oilcloth, the flint and steel she carried out of a habit learned from the trappers. Because a person who could make fire could survive a great many things, a person who could not, would not. What she did not have was any notion of which way lay the world of the living. She chose the direction that felt most like descent and pushed on, because to stand still as the light failed was its own slow death. The forest closed around her, and it was strange, but as the danger sharpened, the loneliness she had carried so long rose up around her like water, around a waiting figure, cold and familiar. All her life she had told herself that being alone was a kind of strength, that a woman who needed no one could never be abandoned. Now, with the snow filling her tracks behind her as fast as she made them, she understood the lie at the bottom of that belief. If she went down out here, no search party would come. No mother would stand at a window watching the road. The widow might wonder, in a day or two, why the girl had not come back for her things. And then she would rent the attic to someone else. That was the whole of the mark she would leave on the world. An unpaid week of board and a carpetbag of mended clothes. The knowledge did not make her weep. It made her walk faster. The wind found a new voice as the true dark came on, a low, mournful drone through the high branches that seemed almost to shape itself into words, if a person listened wrong. Winnie kept her eyes on the ground, and her mind on the next step and the one after, and she had nearly stopped believing the mountain would offer her anything but more mountain, when she glanced left through a gap in the driving snow and saw a shape that stopped her cold. It stood among the pines at the edge of a small clearing, half buried, its lines softened by decades of weather and moss, and for a heartbeat she took it for a great boulder or a fallen giant of a tree. But boulders do not have corners. Trees do not stand square. The shape had edges the storm could not entirely blur, the deliberate geometry that only a human hand makes. And as she pushed toward it through the drifts, her heart began to hammer against her ribs. Not from the cold now, but from something that felt absurdly, out here at the end of everything, like hope. It was a cabin, or it had been born as something else and become a cabin over long years of use. As she drew near, she saw it clear, the sloped roof heavy with snow, the low walls of squared timber gone silver gray, and beneath the accretion of shelter and repair the unmistakable shape of a wagon at its heart, an old freighter's wagon of the kind that had crossed the plains a generation before. Its box grown into a dwelling with lean-tos and additions, until the original bones were nearly hidden. Someone had driven that wagon up into this hollow when the country was younger than she was, and had stopped here and had made of it a home. The wonder of it drove the fear back for a moment. Who would build so far from every road, so deep in a fold of the range that 4 years of living in its shadow had never shown her this place existed? And why? The wind answered with a fresh gust that drove ice against her cheek, and Winnie put the questions away, because questions were for the living, and she meant to keep on being that. She waded to the door through drifts that reached her knees. It was a stout door, plank and iron, set into a frame the years had not yet pulled crooked, and snow had banked against its sill. But when she set her shoulder to it and lifted the wooden latch, the hinges gave with a long groan that seemed to rise up out of the earth itself, and the door swung inward on darkness and the still, held breath of a place that had not been opened in a very long time. She stepped inside and pulled the door to behind her, and all at once the storm went distant. The wind still spoke, but it spoke through walls now, muffled to a rumor, and the snow that had been a stinging assault a moment before was only a soft ticking against the shutters. Winnie stood dripping in the sudden hush, her eyes straining in the near dark, her heart still going hard. It was cold inside, but it was the still cold of enclosed air, not the killing cold of the wind, and after the mountain that difference felt like a benediction. Slowly, as her sight adjusted, the interior gave itself up to her. It was small and it was orderly, and the order was the first thing that told her this had been no rough shelter thrown up by a passing trapper. Every foot of space had been used with a care that spoke of people who meant to stay, who had lived with scarcity long enough to know that waste was a thing they could not afford. A narrow bench ran along one wall, its top worn smooth by years of sitting. Shelves climbed the timbers, still holding the ghosts of a household. A few tin plates, a cracked crock, a coil of rope gone stiff. A table folded up against the wall on iron hinges so it could be let down when needed and put away when the floor was wanted for other work. Pegs for coats. A bunk built into the far end, its rope webbing sagged but sound, and at the center of it all, squat and black and patient, a cast iron stove. Winnie crossed to it the way a drowning swimmer crosses to a spar. She knelt and laid her bare, aching hand against the iron, and it was cold. Of course it was cold, cold as everything else in that room. But it was whole. The firebox door opened at her touch without complaint, and inside she found, incredibly, the makings already laid, kindling and split spruce, arranged by some hand long stilled, waiting. That gave her pause. A stove left ready to light was a stove someone had expected to return to. She filed the strangeness away and did not let herself dwell on it, because her fingers were past aching now into a deep and dangerous numbness, and warmth was the only thought her body would allow. She had her flint and her steel and her scrap of oilcloth for tinder, and she set to the work her hands knew even when her mind was blurred with cold. It was as she bent close to the firebox, coaxing the first frail spark, that she saw the writing. It was carved into the timber of the wall just above the stove, low down where a person kneeling to tend the fire would see it. And it was not decoration. The letters were plain and deep, cut by someone in no hurry, someone who understood that words gouged into wood outlast the hand that gouges them. Keep the low draft open in a storm, it read, or she'll smoke and choke you. Below that, in the same patient hand, dry spruce catches quickest, cottonwood, not at all. And below that, a lower still, nearly, at the floor, one more line that caught the breath in Winnie's throat for reasons she could not at first name. If the smoke backs down, the east pipe wants clearing. Do it before you sleep. She sat back on her heels and stared at the carved lines while the wind moaned beyond the walls. There was nothing sentimental in the words. They were instructions, nothing more. The practical bequest of one person to whatever person came next. And yet something in them reached across the cold dark and touched her more nearly than any kindness she had known in years. Whoever had cut these letters had known that someday another human being might come to this place frightened and freezing, might kneel at this stove with numb fingers and a failing heart, and had wanted, across all the intervening years, to help that stranger live. It was a thought so unlike anything her own life had taught her that she had to blink hard against a stinging in her eyes. She chose to blame on the cold. She did what the wall told her. She found the low draft and worked it open, and saw that indeed she had nearly closed it in her haste. She fed the first catching flame with the dry spruce, and not the pale cottonwood chunks stacked to one side. And when the smoke rose, it did not linger and choke, but climbed clean into the pipe and away. The fire took. It took the way a living thing takes hold of the chance to live. Small and blue at first, then yellow, then leaping, and its light swelled to fill the little room and threw the shelves and the bench and the folded table into flickering relief. Winnie held her hand so close to the firebox that the skin tingled and burned as feeling came back into it, and she let out a breath that was half a laugh. The strange broken laugh that is what relief sounds like, coming from a person unused to it. The warmth spread slow and then all at once, into the iron, into the air, into the very timbers, so that the cabin seemed to wake around her, to remember what it was for. She peeled off her sodden shawl and hung it on a peg as though she had a right to, as though she were a guest and not a trespasser, and she sank onto the worn bench and let the heat do its patient work. Outside, the storm went on screaming its long complaint against the mountain. Inside, for the first time on the day she turned 21, Winifred Sutton was warm and safe, and not alone in quite the way she had been alone that morning. The people who had made this place were long gone. She could feel their absence like a shape in the air, but she could feel their presence too, in the worn bench and the careful shelves and the words cut into the wall to save a stranger's life. And the two feelings together made something she had no name for, a sorrow and a comfort braided so tight she could not have pulled them apart. She might have slept then, worn out as she was. But the mountain was not finished with her, and neither was the cabin. As she shifted her weight along the bench to bring her back closer to the stove, her hip pressed against something in the seat that gave, just slightly, with a sound different from the rest, a hollow knock where solid wood should have been. She went still. She shifted again, deliberately this time, and heard it again, the particular note of empty space behind a panel. Her heart, which had only just begun to slow, picked up once more. She rose and knelt and ran her fingers along the underside of the bench, and there, where the firelight barely reached, her fingertips found what her eyes had missed, a seam too straight to be a crack, and set into it a small iron pull worn, smooth, as if by many hands over many years. She hooked her fingers through it. She hesitated one heartbeat. The way a person hesitates at the edge of a thing they sense will not let them go back to who they were before. Then she drew. A shallow drawer slid out from beneath the bench with a whisper of wood on wood, dust rising gold in the firelight, and inside lay a bundle. It was wrapped in a square of faded cloth, once perhaps blue, now the no color of long-kept things, and bound about with twine gone brittle and dark. It had been placed there with care. That much was plain even before she touched it. It had been wrapped and tied and set into the dark by someone who wanted it kept. Someone who had chosen this hidden drawer over the open shelf. Someone who had trusted the future to bring the right hands to it in the right hour. Winnie lifted it out. It was light, far lighter than the coins her mind had leapt to in the first foolish instant, and when her fingers pressed the cloth, she felt beneath it, not metal, but the soft, yielding thickness of paper, many sheets of it, folded and folded again. She carried the bundle to the bench nearest the stove and sat with it in her lap, and for a long moment she only looked at it, this small mute parcel that had waited in the dark of a forgotten cabin through more winters than she had been alive. The twine crumbled almost at her touch. The cloth fell open, and inside, just as her fingers had promised, were letters. Dozens of them, folded in the old way, sealed once and long since opened, the paper gone the color of weak tea at the edges, the ink faded in places to a ghost of itself, but in others still dark and sure. There was no treasure here in the way the mercantile stranger would have understood treasure. No gold, no bond, no deed. There were only words. Someone's words, set down by lamplight in the very room she now sat in, saved against the ruin of time by hands that had loved something enough to want it to outlast them. She should have been disappointed, perhaps. A part of her had leapt, in the first instant of the sliding drawer, toward some wild, childish hope of riches, the kind of hope a hard life teaches you to be ashamed of even as it rises. But looking down at the letters in the firelight, Winnie felt no disappointment. She felt, instead, something like being addressed, as though a light had been left burning in a far window through a long dark. And she, wandering half frozen out of the storm, had at last seen it and come to it, and found that it had been lit for her, or for someone like her, someone lost and cold and unremembered, someone the world had not thought worth the keeping. She lifted the topmost letter with a care that surprised her, holding it near the stove where the light was best, and unfolded it along creases so old they had nearly worn through. The hand was plain and strong, a working handwriting, unschooled but sure. The letters formed by someone who did not write often, but wrote when it mattered. She had to lean close and turn the page to the firelight to make out the faded lines. But as her eyes found the first words, the wind outside seemed to fall away, and the cold and the whole long empty stretch of the day, until there was nothing in the world but the small yellow light and the voice rising up to her out of the paper across all the silent years. December the 4th, it began. The snow came early this year and hard. The roof held through the night. Thank God. Though Ruth lay awake till dawn certain the wind would tear it off over our heads. It did not. It never has. A man builds a thing well the first time, so he need not build it twice, my father used to say, and I have tried to be that kind of man out here, where there is no one to build it for us but ourselves. Winnie read it twice. The plainness of it, the ordinary domestic worry of a roof in a storm, reached into her with a strange force. She could see them, this Ruth who lay awake fearing the wind, this man who answered fear with the memory of his own father's counsel. They had sat in this room. They had listened to a storm not unlike the one now hammering the shutters, and they had been afraid, and they had held on. She unfolded the next letter, and the next, and the entries were none of them grand. They spoke of firewood laid by and firewood running low, of a doe taken in the autumn that would see them through, of a spring that ran sweet and cold from the rock behind the cabin and never once froze solid no matter how deep the cold, so that they had named it and blessed it and set the whole life of the place around it. There were no adventures in the pages. There was only living, the daily, fierce, persistent work of staying serpent alive and keeping those you loved alive with you. And somehow it moved her more than any tale of daring could have, because it was true and because it was the thing she herself had done every day of her life, without once believing it counted for anything. One name began to come clear as she read, threaded through the entries like a bright cord. A child. A girl. Eliza spent the whole afternoon at the window drawing the mountains on the fogged glass. One letter said, and when I asked what she was making, she told me she was making a map so she would always know the way home. She is 7 now and full of such notions. Ruth says she gets them from me. And later, in the other hand, softer, a woman's this time. Eliza asks every night if the spring will freeze, and every night I tell her no, it has never frozen, and every night she is satisfied and sleeps. A child needs one thing in the world that has never once let her down. For her it is the spring. I hope she is grown before she learns how few such things there are. Winnie sat very still, the letter trembling slightly in her hand, though whether from the cold or from something else she could not have said. She thought of a small girl at this same window, breathing fog onto the glass and drawing the shape of the mountains, so she would always know the way home. And she thought of herself at 7 in a farm kitchen that was not hers, learning already that no window she looked out of would ever be a window she could call her own. She turned the letters gently in her lap, searching without knowing what she searched for, until near the bottom of the bundle she came to one whose paper was a shade fresher than the rest, folded with particular care, and, as she opened it and turned it to the light and read the date written across the top, the breath went out of her all at once, as though the mountain itself had struck her a soft blow to the chest. October the 14th, the letter began. She read it again to be sure. October the 14th. The date sat there in the faded ink, plain and impossible, the same words that had glowed at her from every calendar and record and county form her whole life long, the one day in all the year that belonged to her and to no one who cared. It was her birthday. It was written at the top of a letter penned in this cabin more years ago than she had been alive, by a hand now surely dust, and for a moment she could only stare at it while the fire popped and the wind wailed and her own heart beat loud in her ears. Then she read on, and what she read undid something in her that 21 years of careful solitude had built up strong. Today our Eliza turns 21, the letter said. We had little enough to mark it with. The flower is low, and the winter is long ahead of us, and there was no way to make the day grand. But Ruth had been saving a small store of sugar these 3 months, hidden away where even I did not find it. And this morning she brought out a little cake, no bigger than my 2 hands together, and set it before Eliza with a candle we had made ourselves from the summer's tallow. And Eliza, who came to us so small and so alone that first winter, wrapped in nothing warm enough, and with no name we ever learned but the one we gave her, our Eliza looked at that small cake and she wept. She said it was the finest birthday she had ever known. She said no one had ever saved sugar for her before. And I sat there in this room we built with our own hands, and I thought my heart would break for the joy and the sorrow of it together, that so small a kindness could mean so much, and that there had been so many years of her young life before she came to us, when no one had thought to save her anything at all. Winnie's hand had gone to her mouth. She was not aware of having moved it. She read the words a third time, and a fourth, and the room around her seemed to draw close and grow enormous both at once. A girl who came to them small and alone in a hard winter, wrapped in nothing warm enough, with no name but the one they gave her. 21 years old on the 14th of October, weeping over a little cake because no one had ever saved sugar for her before. Winnie sat in the cabin these strangers had built, on the day she herself turned 21, on the 14th of October, and she read the account of another girl's 21st birthday, written in a hand long stilled, and the distance between herself and that vanished girl folded shut like the covers of a closing book, until she could not have said, in that fire-lit instant where the one life ended and the other began. The fire had burned down to a bed of coals by the time she surfaced from the letters, and the cold had crept back to the edges of the room, testing the corners. She fed the stove without thinking, choosing the dry spruce as the wall had taught her, and watched the flames climb again while her mind stayed fixed on the vanished girl who had wept over a cake. Eliza. The name carried a weight now that no name had carried for her before. She wanted to know everything. Wanted it with a sudden fierce hunger that startled her. And she went back into the bundle with more care than greed, unfolding the letters she had not yet read, laying them in order as best she could tell by the dates and the deepening familiarity of the 2 hands. What she pieced together over the next hours, as the storm settled into a long steady siege against the shutters, was not a single story but the slow accumulation of a life. The way a life is actually lived, in seasons and small crises and smaller joys. The man who wrote the firmer hand was named Ezra. His wife signed herself only R, or sometimes Ruth when the entry ran long and the feeling ran high. They had come up into this hollow when the territory was raw and unmapped, before Red Willow was more than a crossing and a trading post. And they had chosen this fold of the Silvercrest range for one reason above all others. A reason the letters returned to, again and again, with a devotion that puzzled Winnie until she understood it. The spring. The cold, sweet spring that ran from the rock behind the cabin and never froze. In a country where a hard winter could seal a family away from open water for months and drive them to melting snow over a fire that ate their fuel faster than they could cut it. A spring that ran free through the deepest cold was not a convenience. It was life itself. Ezra had built his whole world around that thread of moving water, and he wrote of it the way another man might write of a fortune. It was in an entry from an early winter, the ink browned nearly to invisibility, that Winnie found the thing that stopped her hand and made her read the lines 3 times before she would let herself believe them. Ruth wept again tonight over the child Ezra had written, not from sorrow now, but from the fear that comes after a great gladness, the fear of losing what you never thought to hope for. It is near 3 years since we found her, and still Ruth wakes in the night, to be sure she is breathing. We do not speak often of how she came to us. It is enough that she is ours. But I set it down here once, so it will not be lost, that our Eliza was not born to us. She was left, as such children sometimes are in a hard country, at the mission down on the flat, in the worst week of the worst winter I have known, with nothing warm about her and no word of who had carried her there or why. Ruth had gone down for flour and could not leave her. I have never in my life seen my wife want a thing the way she wanted that child. We carried her up the mountain wrapped in my own coat, and she has been the light of this house every day since, and I say before God that no child born of my body could be more truly mine. Winnie lowered the letter and sat unmoving in the coal light. The wind pressed against the cabin. She was aware of her own breathing, slow and deliberate, the way a person breathes who is trying to keep the walls of herself from buckling. Eliza had been a foundling, left at a mission in a hard winter with nothing warm about her and no name that anyone kept. It was not the same story as her own. The particulars differed. The mission was not the mission where she herself had been found. The years lay far apart. The flour sack and the coat were different flour sacks and coats, and yet the shape of it was the same shape, the exact same shape, a small unwanted life set down in the cold and left for the world to keep or to let perish. The difference was only this, that someone had come for Eliza. A woman had gone down the mountain for flour and had come back up unable to leave a stranger's child behind. And that single refusal, that one act of a heart that would not do the sensible thing, had turned an abandoned infant into a beloved daughter, who wept for joy over sugar saved 3 months in secret. No one had come for Winnie. That was the whole of the difference between the two of them, and it was everything. And reading it there in the failing firelight, she felt it not as fresh grief, but as something stranger, a grief turned inside out. Because the letters were telling her that it could have gone the other way, that the line between a life like Eliza's and a life like her own was not fate, was not merit, was not anything the abandoned child had done or failed to do. It was only whether, in the cold, someone chose not to walk on. All her life Winnie had carried, buried so deep she had never once looked straight at it, the suspicion that she had been left, because there was something in her not worth the keeping. The letters took that suspicion in their old brown hands and quietly broke it. Eliza had been just as unwanted, just as unnamed, just as small and cold and alone. The only thing Eliza had been that Winnie had not was lucky in the one person who found her. She read on into the night, and the family grew real around her. More real than the storm, more real than the cold, more real in some way than the people of Red Willow among whom she had lived 4 years without belonging. She learned that Eliza had wanted, as a girl, to be a teacher, that she had practiced her letters first on the fogged window, and later on a slate Ezra had traded 3 days' labor to get her, that she pressed wildflowers between the pages of the one book the family owned, so that even in the depth of winter she could open it and find the summer waiting. She learned that Ruth's health had troubled her in the later years, a winter cough that came and did not fully leave, and that Ezra's entries in those seasons carried a tightness beneath the plain words, the tightness of a man watching the person he loves grow thin and refusing to write the fear down where she might read it. And she learned, threaded through all of it, that this family had been happy. Not untroubled, not spared, but happy in the deep way that has nothing to do with ease, the happiness of people who have exactly enough, and each other, and know the value of both. It was long past the middle of the night when she came to the letter that changed the shape of everything. that turned the quiet miracle of the cabin into something with edges and danger, and a reaching hand. Its paper was heavier, better kept, folded smaller and tighter than the rest, as though it had been meant to be hidden rather than merely saved. And it had been tucked not into the general bundle, but into a fold of the blue cloth itself, so that she nearly missed it. When she opened it, the first line lifted the hair on her arms. If a stranger's hands are unfolding this, it read, then the thing I feared has come to pass, and I am gone, and Eliza with me or gone on ahead into the world, and this house stands empty in the mountains, waiting for whoever the storm drives to its door. So I will write to you, whoever you are, as though you sat across this table from me, because a man cannot carry certain things out of the world without setting them down for someone. Winnie's whole attention narrowed to the page. The fire ticked. She read on, and Ezra's voice, which she had come to know across a night of reading as steady and plain and unafraid, took on a new note, urgent and careful, the note of a man laying a burden gently into hands he cannot see. We did not come to this hollow only for the spring, though the spring was reason enough. We came because a man named Thorne wanted us gone from the good bottomland we first settled, down where Red Willow sits now, and a man like that, once he wants a thing, does not stop wanting it. He had money, and he had the ear of the men who kept the records, and he meant to have our claim by fair means or foul, and when fair would not serve, he turned to foul. I will not set down here all that he did. It is enough to say that I saw a way we might lose everything we had built, not to weather or sickness, or any honest hardship, but to a man with a pen and a friend in the land office. So I did what I could. I proved up our claim in full and lawful order, every requirement met, every year of residence sworn and witnessed, and I got the patent for it signed and sealed, the true deed, to this ground. The paper that says before the government of these United States that this land is ours and cannot be taken. And then, because I did not trust that the paper would be safe in any office Thorne's money could reach, I brought it here, up the mountain, and I hid it where his kind would never think to look, in the last place a greedy man searches, which is a poor man's home. Winnie set the letter down with a hand that was not quite steady, and looked around the small room as though it had rearranged itself while she read, which, in a way, it had. Somewhere in this cabin, if the dead man told the truth, lay the true deed to the ground beneath her, hidden by a father who feared for his daughter's inheritance more than he feared his own death. She thought of the stranger at the mercantile, Silas Thorne, with his town coat and his talk of empty ground and abandoned claims a man could take for the back taxes, if he knew which ones, and moved quick. The name had meant nothing to her that morning. It meant a great deal now. She did not yet let herself follow the thought all the way to its end, but the beginning of it had already turned cold in her chest. She read the last of the letter with the fire's light failing on the page. Whoever you are, reading this in my house, warming yourself at my stove, I ask you one thing. If Eliza yet lives, or any child of hers, then what is hidden here is theirs, and I charge you before your own conscience to see it into their hands. And if there is no one left of my blood, if the line has run out into the dark as lines do, then I will tell you what I have come to believe in my long nights in this place. A man's true legacy is not the gold he hides, nor the ground he holds. It is the warmth he leaves in a cold place for a stranger he will never meet. If this house has kept you alive, then it has already given you the whole of my fortune, and you owe my memory nothing. But if you have it in you to carry a kindness forward the way it was carried to my Eliza when she was small and left in the cold, then do that, and we are square, you and I, across all the years between us. She did not weep. The feeling was too large for weeping, and anyway she had wept earlier over the cake and had none of that easy sorrow left. What she felt instead, sitting in the deep quiet of the ruined night with the dead man's charge in her lap, was something she could only have named as being chosen. All her life she had been the one nobody sent for. Now a voice out of the far past had reached across the years and set a task in her hands, had trusted her, a stranger, a foundling, a woman the world had not thought worth the keeping, with the thing he had cared about most in his life. It did not matter that he had never known her name. It did not matter that he had been dust before she was born. He had trusted whoever came, and she had come, and the trust was hers now to keep or to break. And no one had ever trusted her with anything that mattered before. The storm broke sometime before dawn. She did not notice the moment it happened, only that, at some point, the great voice of the wind had gone still. And when she next lifted her head, the shutters had stopped their rattling, and a gray light was seeping in around them. She had not slept. She rose stiff from the bench, her back aching, her eyes gritty, and she opened the door onto a world remade. The snow had buried the clearing knee-deep and lay heavy on the pines, and the air was so still and cold and clear that it seemed to ring. The storm that had nearly killed her had also, she understood, now, driven her to the one door in all that country she most needed to find. She stood in the doorway, breathing the clean morning, and thought that she had walked up this mountain a woman with nothing and no one, and that she was not that woman any longer, though she could not yet have said what she had become. But she could not leave. Not yet. The deed was here, or Ezra had believed it was, and she could not carry his charge down the mountain, while the most important thing he had asked of her lay hidden in the walls behind her. She turned back inside and began methodically to search. She was thorough in the way poverty teaches a person to be thorough, missing nothing, respecting the smallness of the space. She read the carved instructions above the stove again, wondering if the words themselves held a hidden meaning. But they were only what they were, a stranger's care for a stranger's survival. She checked the shelves, ran her hands behind the tins and the crock, felt along the timber joints for seams. She examined the bunk, the folded table, the pegs, the very stones of the hearth. It was near midday, the light strong now through the open door, when she came back to the bench where she had found the letters, and knelt before it with a different question in her mind. Ezra had hidden the letters in a drawer beneath the seat. A careful man does not put his two greatest treasures in the same place, where one discovery would yield both. But a careful man might well put them near each other, in a spot he thought of as the heart of the house, so that whoever found the one might be led to look for the other. She pressed her palms flat to the floorboards before the bench and worked her way outward, testing each plank for the give and the hollow note that had betrayed the drawer. Most were solid, nailed fast to the joists below, but near the base of the bench, where a person kneeling to draw out the letters would naturally rest her weight, one board sat a hair proud of its neighbors, and when she pressed it, the far end lifted, just slightly, on a pivot she could not see. Her heart began its hard climb again. She worked her fingers into the seam, and the board came up, and beneath it, set down into a cavity between the joists, lined with oilcloth against the damp, lay a second bundle, and beside it, wrapped separately, something small and heavy that clinked faintly as her fingers brushed it. She lifted them both into the light. The wrapped weight she opened first, and found within it a leather pouch gone stiff with age. And when she loosened the drawstring and tipped it over her palm, coins slid out. Gold coins. A small, heavy stream of them. More money than she had seen in one place in the whole of her life. She sat back on her heels with the gold cold and bright in her hand, and felt the old shameful hope leap in her again. And then she looked at the second bundle, the flat one, wrapped in the same oilcloth. And she knew before she opened it that this was the thing that mattered. This was the true treasure the gold was only the guard of. She set the coins carefully aside. She unwrapped the flat bundle, and there it was, exactly as the letter had promised. A single large sheet of heavy paper folded once, its surface crowded with formal script, and at its foot the impressed seal of the Land Office of the United States, the raised device still crisp beneath her fingertips. After all the years, the patent to the ground of the Vance claim, made out in full and lawful order to Ezra Vance, proved up, signed, sealed, and true. She held in her two hands the thing a man had feared for more than his own life, the inheritance he had hidden from a thief and entrusted to the future. The paper trembled very slightly. She made herself breathe, and then, kneeling on the cold floor of the cabin with the deed in her hands, and the gold at her knee, and the dead man's charge ringing in her, Winnie became aware of a sound that did not belong. It was faint, muffled by the snow and the timber. But it was there, and it was wrong, because it was the sound of the world of men where no world of men should be. A voice. More than one voice. And beneath the voices, the crunch and squeak of boots breaking through crust, coming closer. She did not move for the space of 3 breaths. Then she moved fast. She wrapped the deed in its oilcloth and thrust it inside her bodice against her skin where nothing short of violence would find it. The gold she pushed deep into the satchel among the mending she still carried. She was rising, half turned toward the door, when the light from the window changed, a shadow passing across it, and she froze where she stood. The door, which she had left standing open on the clean morning, framed a man. He was broad and slow-eyed, dressed for hard country in a mackinaw crusted with snow, and he filled the doorway with the unhurried confidence of a man who does not expect to be told no. Behind him, a second shape moved, thinner, stamping the cold out of its feet. The broad man looked at Winnie the way a man looks at a thing he did not expect to find and has not yet decided the use of. "Well," he offered, and the single word carried a whole disposition in it, unfriendly and unsurprised. Somebody's home, after all. Winnie's mind went very clear, the way it had gone clear in the storm, fear burning off into a cold, bright attention. She had one advantage, and she knew it, which was that they did not know what she carried. To them, she was a stray girl caught out by the weather, sheltering in an empty cabin. Nothing more. If she could keep it that way, she might walk out of here with Ezra's charge, still hidden against her heart. Lost in the storm, she managed, letting her voice shake, which was not hard. The snow drove me up here. I only wanted a fire. The broad man came in without being asked, ducking under the low lintel, his boots dropping clods of snow on the swept floor. The thin one followed, and now she saw his face, and her stomach dropped, because though he was younger, there was a kinship in the sharp features. And when he spoke, his voice carried the same faint suggestion of a room. He expected to arrange itself around him. "A fire," he repeated, letting his gaze travel over the cabin. The shelves, the stove, the disturbed floorboards she had not had time to set right. "In a cabin nobody's lived in since before you were born. That's a long walk for a fire, girl." His eyes came to rest on the raised plank by the bench, and something in his face sharpened. "What have you been digging for up here?" "Nothing." The lie came fast. "I don't know what you mean." "I was cold, I looked for more wood, that's all." He crossed to the bench in 3 strides, and looked down at the open cavity between the joists. The oilcloth she had not managed to hide. The shape of an emptied hiding place. Plain to any eye that knew to look. He crouched, drew out the empty wrapping, turned it over in his hands. When he stood and faced her again, the pretense had gone out of him, and what was left was worse. "You'll want to know who you're dealing with," he told her, though she had not asked. "That's my brother's man, Coyle, and I'm Marcus Thorne. My brother Silas has an interest in this ground. A legal interest, or he will have inside the week. So you might say you're trespassing on what's near enough ours already." He let the oilcloth fall. "Now, there was something in that hole. It's not there now. Which means either it was gone before you came, or it's on you. And I'd sooner not search a woman, but I've done less pleasant things for less money. So let's neither of us make it come to that." Winnie held very still. The deed lay against her skin, a stiff square she was suddenly certain they could see through the wool, and the gold in her satchel seemed to shout its weight. Her thoughts moved fast over the ground, the way water moves over a flooded field, finding every low place, every gap. She could not fight 2 men. She could not outrun them through knee-deep snow down a mountain she had gotten lost on in the first place. What she had instead was the thing she had always had. The only weapon a life like hers hands you, which was the ability to be underestimated. She let her shoulders fall. She let her chin drop. She made herself small and frightened and harmless, which cost her nothing, because part of her was exactly that. And she reached slowly into her satchel, past the gold, and drew out not the gold but the first letter of the bundle, the topmost one, the one about the roof and the storm and Ezra's father's counsel. An old brown page that meant everything and looked like nothing. "There were only these," she said, holding the letter out with a trembling hand, letting a single Tear come because tears came easy when she called them. Old letters. A family that lived here. I found them under the bench and I was reading them. That's all, I swear it. I've got no interest in anybody's land. I don't even know where I am. She let the page shake in the cold air between them. Take them if you want them. They're only somebody's letters. I never had a family of my own, and I only wanted to know who lived here. And here her voice did break, entirely without her planning it, because the words were true, and the truth of them cut through the performance and made it real. Coyle plucked the letter from her hand and squinted at the faded lines, and she saw with a flood of relief that the old-fashioned hand defeated him, that to him it was so much waste paper. Marcus Thorne took it from him and read it faster, his lip curling, and she watched him weigh it. Watched him decide that a lost girl's found letters were not the thing his brother had sent him up the mountain for. He crumpled the page in his fist, and it was all Winnie could do not to cry out, not to lunge for it, as Ezra's words about the roof holding through the night were crushed to a ball and dropped on the floor. Sentiment, he pronounced, as though it were a disease. You came all the way up here and near froze to death over dead people's letters. He looked at her a long moment, and she met his eyes with the wide, empty look of a harmless fool, and at last something in him decided she was not worth the trouble. Get out. Go on back to whatever town you crawled up from, and if you've got any sense, you'll forget you ever saw this place. My brother doesn't care for people taking an interest in his property. It has a way of turning out poorly for them. She did not need telling twice. She gathered her shawl from the peg, with hands she allowed to shake, and she stooped as though by accident and swept up the crumpled letter from the floor, along with the hem of her skirt, folding it into her fist unseen. She left the rest of the bundle where it lay on the bench, because to take it would have been to admit it had worth, and it near killed her to leave those pages in that man's hands. But the deed was against her heart, and the deed was what Ezra had charged her to save. At the door she paused, playing the frightened girl to the last, and Marcus Thorne was already turning from her, crouching again over the empty hiding place, running his hands along the joists, in search of what she carried out under his very eyes. She walked out into the snow. She did not run. Running was what the guilty did, and she needed them to keep believing she was only a foolish girl, with a satchel of mending and a head full of dead strangers' sorrows. She crossed the clearing at a stumbling, weary pace, and only when the pines had closed behind her and the cabin was lost to sight did she let herself move faster, breaking downhill through the drifts. Following the churned trail the two men had broken on their way up, which at least gave her a path back toward the world. The deed rode stiff and warm against her skin with every step, and the gold dragged at her shoulder, and in her fist was a crushed brown letter about a roof that had held through 100 winters. And Winnie went down the mountain, carrying the whole hidden legacy of a family the world had forgotten. Behind her climbed the knowledge that those men served the same Silas Thorne who had stood in the mercantile talking of empty ground, and that Marcus Thorne's promise of a legal interest inside the week was no idle boast, but a countdown, a wheel already turning somewhere in the county offices of Red Willow that would grind the Vance claim into Thorne's hands unless she found a way to jam it. She had the true deed. She did not yet know whether one lost girl with a dead man's inheritance against her heart could stand up in the world of men, with their pens and their friends in the land office and be believed. But she meant to try, and she knew, going down through the cold bright noon with a dead man's trust burning in her chest, that for the first time in her life, she was running towards something instead of away. The trail the men had broken led her, after a wrong turning and a hard hour, back to ground she knew, the pines thinning into the foothills falling toward the creek, and by the time the light began to fail again, she could see far below the thin gray thread of smoke that meant Red Willow. But she was not yet down when she understood that the day would not release her so easily, because the sky over the Silvercrest range had gone once more the color of a bruise, and the wind that had died before dawn was rising again out of the west, with a new load of snow riding it. The second storm caught her on the last of the foothills, where the trail ran along a shelf of rock above the creek, and it came not as the slow gathering of the day before, but as a sudden, hard shove of wind that staggered her against the stone. She caught herself with a scraped palm and pressed on, bent nearly double, the deed a stiff square of warmth against her ribs, the gold pulling her satchel into her hip with every lurching step. The light was going fast. Below her, the creek ran black between white banks, and the smoke of red willow had vanished behind the driving snow, so that she navigated by memory and by the downhill pull of the land, trusting her feet where her eyes could no longer serve. It was on that narrow shelf, with the drop to the creek on her left hand and the rock rising on her right, that the wind took her satchel. A gust came up off the water, hard enough to lift the flap she had not fastened, and the leather pouch of gold, loosened by the long descent, slid free and struck the ice-slick stone at the lip of the shelf. She lunged for it. Her fingers closed on the drawstring, even as the pouch went over the edge, and for one terrible moment, she hung half over the drop with the whole weight of Ezra's gold swinging from 2 fingers above the black water. Her boots scrabbled for purchase on the frozen rock. She could let it fall. The thought came cold and clear. She could open her hand, and the gold would be gone into the creek, and she would be safe on the shelf, and no one would ever know she had let a small fortune drop into the dark. She did not open her hand. She hauled backward with everything her aching body had left, dragging the pouch up over the lip, falling back against the rock wall with the gold clutched to her chest and her breath tearing in and out of her. It was not the money. She understood that even in the moment, gasping against the stone. If it had been only money, she might well have let it go to save herself the risk. But Ezra had wrapped that gold with his own hands and hidden it for a daughter he loved, and to let it fall would have been to fail him in the one thing he had asked, and she found she would sooner have gone over a choice the edge herself than break the trust a dead man had placed in a stranger. She knotted the drawstring twice, buried the pouch deep in the satchel, and fastened the flap with fingers that would barely bend. Then she got up, because the storm did not care what she had nearly lost, and she went on down. She came into Red Willow long after full dark, a snow-caked figure, staggering, out of the white into the yellow smear of the saloon windows, and she went not to the boarding house and her cold attic, but straight through the empty street to the one house where a light still burned, the small frame house behind the assay office where the county recorder kept his rooms. Abel Pruitt was a spare, gray, careful man who had held his office in Carroll County for 11 years and had a reputation, rare enough in the territory, for being unbuyable. Winnie had never exchanged more than a dozen words with him in her life. She hammered on his door with the side of her fist because her fingers would not make a knuckle. And when he opened it, lamp in hand, and took in the sight of her, snow to the waist and swaying on his step, his careful face rearranged itself into alarm. "Girl, you'll die of the cold." "What in heaven?" He got an arm under hers and drew her in out of the storm before she could get the words out, and the sudden warmth of his rooms hit her like a wall, so that she nearly went down. He put her in a chair by his stove and pressed a cup of something hot into her hands. And only when the worst of the shaking had passed did he let her speak. By then she had decided how much to tell him, which was everything. She told it plainly the way Ezra had written, without ornament. The walk up the mountain, the storm, the wagon cabin in the hollow that no map showed, the letters, the family that had lived and died there, and then, drawing the oilcloth packet from inside her bodice with hands that had finally begun to warm, she told him of the deed and laid it open on the table, under his lamp, the great sheet of heavy paper with its crowded script and its raised federal seal, and she watched the careful man go very still. Pruitt did not touch it at first. He bent over it with his hands clasped behind his back, the way a man approaches something he is half afraid to believe, and read it through twice by the lamplight, his lips moving slightly over the legal phrases. When he straightened, his face had changed again, and what was in it now was a kind of grim wonder. "This is a patent," he said, low, as much to himself as to her. "A land patent, proved up and signed under the General Land Office for a claim in the Silvercrest Range. Ezra Vance." He looked up at her sharply. Do you know what you're holding? A patent is the end of the line. It's the government itself saying this ground belongs to this man, free and clear, forever. There's no higher paper. There's nothing that beats it. His mouth thinned. Nothing but its absence, which is exactly what makes it worth killing for. The word sat between them. Winnie set her cup down. There's a man means to take that ground, she told him. Silas Thorne. He's got his brother and another man up at the cabin now, tearing up the floor looking for what I'm carrying. They said Thorne would have a legal interest in the claim inside the week. What did they mean by that? Pruitt's expression curdled. He crossed to a shelf crowded with ledgers, ran his finger along the spines, and drew one out, laying it open on the table beside the deed. I mean this, he said, and turned the book so she could see. 3 weeks passed. A filing came through my office. A petition for tax title on a lapsed claim up in the Silvercrest, filed on the grounds that the original holder was deceased. The claim abandoned, the back taxes unpaid these many years. The petitioner offered to satisfy the arrears and take title. His finger stopped on a line of his own neat hand. The petitioner is a land company. But the man who signed the papers, the man who came into this office smiling and left his card, was Silas Thorne. Winnie felt the cold that had nothing to do with the storm. Then he's doing it lawfully, she said. Through the county. Through you. He's doing it to look lawful. Pruitt's jaw worked. A tax title on an abandoned claim is a real thing, girl. If a man dies and leaves ground with no heir and no one pays the tax, the county can sell that ground to recover what it's owed, and in time the buyer gets good title. It happens honestly 100 times a year, but it rests on one thing, that the claim truly lapsed, that there was no valid patent, that the ground reverted to the public domain to be taxed and sold. He set his hand flat on the deed. This says otherwise. This says Ezra Vance proved up his claim in full and got his patent long ago. Patented land isn't taxed and sold like an ordinary parcel. It belongs to the patentee and his heirs, deed or no deed, tax or no tax. If this is genuine, then Thorne's whole petition is built on a lie, that the claim lapsed, when it never lapsed at all. He looked at her, and the grimness deepened. Which is why he needs this paper gone. As long as it exists, his tax title is fraud. The moment it's destroyed, his lie becomes the only record, and the ground is his. The pieces settled into place in Winnie's mind with a cold click. Ezra had feared exactly this, 40 years before it came to pass. He had known that a patent kept in a county office was only as safe as the honesty of the men who kept it, and that a man with money and patience could make paper vanish from a courthouse as easily as from a burning house. So he had hidden the true deed in the last place a greedy man would look, and had trusted that if the day ever came, whoever found it would understand. Then we file it, Winnie said. We record it here tonight. In your book, we make it real. Pruitt did not answer at once, and the silence frightened her more than any words could have. He lowered himself into the chair across from her, and the lamplight caught the deep lines of a man doing a hard sum. It's not so simple, he told her finally. I can enter it into the record, yes. I can note that on this night, a patent was presented to this office. But a recording is not the same as proof, and Thorne will not lie down. The moment he learns this paper exists, he will do one of two things. He will move to have it declared a forgery, some clever fake cooked up to cloud his title. Or he will move faster than the law can, buy the men who need buying, and have the petition granted before this deed is ever tested. He rubbed his gray face, and there is the deeper trouble, the one that will sink us if the rest does not. This patent is made out to Ezra Vance. Vance is dead. For his deed to hold, someone must stand up and be his heir, must have a claim of blood or law to the ground it deeds. His pale eyes fixed on her, not unkindly, but without mercy for the truth. You are not Ezra Vance's daughter. You are not his kin. You found his letters in the snow. In the eyes of the land office, you are a stranger who walked out of a storm carrying another man's deed, and Thorne's lawyer will call you exactly that, a stranger, or worse, a thief. The word landed where he must have known it would. Winnie sat with it, the fire snapping in the little stove, the storm walking on the roof. All her life the world had looked at her and seen a stray, a foundling, A girl with a name pinned to a flour sack and no one behind her, and now, at the one moment it mattered most, the world would look at her and see the same thing. And, this time being seen truly, would cost a dead man his last wish. She had carried the deed down a mountain, over a shelf of rock, up out of a black creek by two fingers. And it might all come to nothing, because she was no one. Because she had always been no one. Because the child no one came for had grown into a woman no board would believe. There is Eliza, she said, grasping at the one thread the letters had left her. His daughter. If she lived, if she left children, then find them. Pruitt spread his hands. An heir of the body or of any blood. And the deed stands like a mountain and Thorne answers for what he's tried. But you don't know if the girl lived. You don't know where she went or what became of her, or whether she left a living soul behind. And you have days, not years. Thorne's petition comes before the county board the day after tomorrow. He shook his head slowly. I'll do what I can. I'll enter the deed tonight, so there's a record it came before me, and that alone may give Thorne pause. But I won't lie to you, girl. Right now you hold the truth in your hand and no one to speak for it. And in my experience, the truth without a witness is the loneliest thing in the world. They recorded it that night, the two of them, by lamplight, while the storm spent itself against the town. Pruitt entered the patent into his book in his careful hand. The date, the description of the claim, the name of the patentee, the fact of its presentation. And he had Winnie make her mark as the one who brought it, and he signed as recorder and pressed the county seal into the wax so that whatever else came, there would be one page in one book that said the deed had surfaced and been seen. It was not much, but it was more than the Vance name had had that morning. And when Winnie finally lay down on a pallet, Pruitt made up for her by his stove, too spent to walk to her own cold room. She held to that small solid fact against the fear that the truth was now written down where a man had sworn to keep it. Word travels fast in a small town, faster than any storm, and by the middle of the next morning Silas Thorne knew. Winnie was at Pruitt's table over a bowl of oats when the knock came. Unhurried, confident, the knock of a man who has never once doubted a door would open to him. Pruitt let him in because there was no lawful way to keep him out. And Silas Thorne stepped into the recorder's rooms, brushing snow from the shoulders of his town coat, his sharp features arranged into an expression of pleasant regret. Behind him came Marcus, and behind Marcus the broad shape of Coyle, filling the doorway. Thorne's gaze found Winnie at once, and she saw him place her, saw him fit the frightened girl his brother had described in the cabin to the woman now sitting at the recorder's table, and saw him understand in the same instant that she had played them all for fools. Something flickered behind his eyes, not anger, worse than anger, a cold recalculation. You've been busy, he observed, unwinding his scarf as though he meant to stay. I'll confess I'm impressed. My brother took you for a lost little thing crying over old letters. He let his eyes travel to the record book still open on the table, the wax seal catching the light. And instead you've been carrying something of mine down out of the mountains and into the public record. That was clever. It was also a mistake, but we'll come to that. It was never yours. Winnie kept her voice level, though her pulse jumped. It belongs to the man who proved it up. You know that. You've known it all along. That's why you sent your brother to burn it out of the walls. Thorne smiled, a smile with nothing behind it. I don't know what my brother does in his leisure. I know what the county record shows. It shows a claim in the Silvercrest, lapsed and unpaid these many years, its holder long dead without heir, reverted to the public domain and lawfully open to a tax title, which I have petitioned to acquire, in full accordance with the statutes of this territory. He drew a folded paper from his coat and laid it on the table with two fingers, unhurried, the gesture of a man laying down a winning card. This is the certificate of the county assessor. It confirms the claim delinquent. It confirms no heir of record. It is signed and it is sealed, and it is a great deal more than a smudged old sheet a vagrant girl says she found under a floorboard. Pruitt picked up the assessor's certificate and read it, and Winnie watched his careful face and saw the trouble in it, and her heart sank, because she understood that Thorne had not come to bluster. He had come because he had papers of his own, official papers. The machinery of the county turned to his purpose, and against that she had a single sheet and the word of a girl no one knew. The assessor, Pruitt said slowly, setting the certificate down, seems very certain there was no heir of record. That's a strong statement to make about ground nobody's set foot on in 40 years. The assessor is thorough. Thorne's voice did not change. As am I, which brings me to my purpose here, since I dislike leaving things to chance. He turned to Winnie, and now the pleasantness thinned to show the edge beneath. I'm a practical man, and I bear you no ill will. You found something valuable. That's worth something. I'll give you $200, cash, for that paper and your silence. And you can walk out of this town today with more money than a girl in your position sees in 10 years, and no more trouble from me or mine. Or, he let the word hang. You can hold on to it and stand up before the county board tomorrow and have my lawyer take you apart in front of the whole county. He'll ask how a foundling with no people came to be carrying a dead man's deed. He'll ask what else went missing from that cabin. Gold, perhaps. He'll suggest, very reasonably, that you're a thief who robbed an old ruin and forged a claim to cover it, and there won't be one soul in that room to say otherwise, because you don't have one soul, do you? You never have. His eyes held hers, cold and knowing. I've looked into you. There's no one behind you. There never was. That's a hard truth, but I didn't make it. I'm only the man offering you $200 to stop pretending it isn't so. It was cruelly done, and it found every old wound with the precision of a man who had made a study of where they lay. Winnie sat very still under it. She thought of the gold in her satchel, which his lawyer would indeed call theft. She thought of the mark she had made in Pruitt's book, a foundling's shaky signature standing witness against a rich man's forged lie. She thought that Thorne was right about the shape of it, that she was exactly what he said, a girl with no one behind her, and that in the world of pens and seals and county boards, a girl with no one behind her did not win against a man with everyone. You're wrong about one thing, she said at last, her voice quiet, but it did not shake. You think being alone makes a person easy to break. But someone who's had nothing her whole life isn't afraid of losing it. You've got everything to keep, Mr. Thorne. I've got nothing but a dead man's trust, and that's the one thing you can't buy off me. Because it's the only thing anyone ever gave me that was worth having. She pushed his folded certificate back across the table toward him. Keep your $200. I'll see you at the board. Something shut behind Thorne's eyes. He gathered his certificate, rewound his scarf with slow, deliberate care, and at the door he paused and looked back at her, the pleasant mask entirely gone now. You've made a poor trade, he told her. Tomorrow you'll understand it. There's no shame in a girl like you losing to a man like me. It's only the natural order of things. But there's a great deal of shame in choosing to lose when you were offered a way out. And that shame you'll carry alone, the way you carry everything. Then he was gone into the snow with his brother and Coil at his heel, and the door closed. And Winnie sat in the ringing quiet and understood that she had just refused the only sure thing she would ever be offered. In exchange for a fight she was almost certain to lose. Pruitt let out a long breath. That was well said, he told her. It was also, I fear, exactly what he wanted. Now he knows you won't sell, and he'll come to the board ready to bury you. He rubbed his temples. We have today and tonight. If there is a living heir of Ezra Vance anywhere in this country, we must find some trace of them before tomorrow. Or Thorne's lie carries the day. He rose, crossed to his shelves, and began pulling down the older record books, the ones bound in cracked leather, their pages foxed with age. The Vance settled here before the county was organized, before my time. If there's any record of them at all, of the girl, of what became of the family, it'll be in these. The old church rolls, the early land filings, the marriage and death books the territory kept before there was a proper county to keep them. He set a stack before her that reached to her chin. You can read? I can read. Then read. And pray. If you're the praying kind, that somewhere in 40 years of the dead this county kept, there's one line that says a Vance lived on past that mountain. They read through the short gray afternoon and into the lamplit night. The two of them bent over the crumbling books, while the town went quiet under its new snow. And for a long time they knew nothing but the ordinary sad arithmetic of a hard country, births and marriages and deaths, claims filed and claims abandoned, none of them Vance. Winnie's eyes burned. The letters had told her Liza wanted to be a teacher, that she pressed flowers in a book, that she drew the mountains on a fogged window so she would always know the way home. But the letters had ended, as such things do, before their story did, and beyond the last dated page, Eliza Vance walked off the edge of the known world into silence. It was Winnie who found it, near midnight, in a water-stained volume of the early territorial marriage records, a single line in a clerk's cramped hand, and she read it 3 times before she trusted herself to speak. "Pruitt, here, look here." He came around the table and bent to where her finger rested, and read the line aloud, low. Eliza Vance of the Silvercrest claim to Thomas Renfrew of this county, recorded the spring of 1845. He straightened slowly. She married. Eliza Vance married and took the name Renfrew. Winnie's mind was already running ahead, down a road she had not known was there. Because the name was not a stranger's name, the name belonged to a face she knew. "Renfrew," she breathed. "Pruitt, there are Renfrews still. Mabel Renfrew, out on the Carrow Road. She does mending for the church. I've carried work to her door." She looked up, hardly daring the thought. Could it be? Her people came from off the flat, I always understood. Pruitt frowned, working the genealogy he carried in his recorder's head. But I've never rightly known where Mabel Renfrew came from before that. She was here when I came, and she's the kind who keeps to herself. His eyes came up to meet Winnie's, and in them was the first real hope she had seen since she'd laid the deed on his table. "There's one way to know, and it's a cold ride out the Carrow Road at midnight in the snow." They went. Pruitt hitched his old mare to the sledge, and they set out into the frozen dark, the runners hissing over the new snow, the stars hard and close overhead, now that the storm had passed, and Winnie held the deed against her heart, and the letters in her lap, and did not feel the cold at all. The Renfrew place was a low, snug cabin with smoke standing straight up from its chimney in the still air. And when Pruitt's knock brought a lamp to the window and then the door, it was Mabel Renfrew herself who opened it. A gray-haired woman with a strong, plain face and flowers still on her apron from the day's baking, blinking at her midnight callers with more curiosity than alarm. Winnie could not wait for Pruitt to explain. She stepped into the lamplight with the bundle of letters held out in both hands like an offering, and the words came out of her in a rush. "Mrs. Renfrew, I'm sorry to come so late, but I have to ask you something, and it can't wait till morning. Was your mother named Eliza?" "Eliza Vance, that grew up on a claim in the Silvercrest Range, in a cabin built from a wagon, by a spring that never froze." The woman went very still in the doorway. Her hand rose to the frame, and her face, which had been merely puzzled, began to change, to open, something moving beneath it that had not stirred in a long time. "The spring that never froze," she repeated, and her voice had gone soft and far off. "My mother used to tell of it. When I was small, on the cold nights, she'd tell of the spring up on the mountain that ran sweet all winter long when everything else was locked in ice, and how her father set the whole life of the place around it. She said it was the one thing in the world that never once let her down." Her eyes, wet now, lifted to Winnie's. "She said her father built her a home from a wagon before I was born in a hollow no road went to. I never saw it. She came down off that mountain a young woman and never went back, but she carried it in her all her days." Her gaze dropped to the letters in Winnie's outstretched hands, the old brown folded pages, and her breath caught. "Child, what is it you're holding?" "Your grandfather's words," Winnie said, and her own eyes had filled. "Ezra Vance. He wrote them for whoever came. He wrote them for you." She pressed the bundle gently into the woman's trembling hands. "He left something for his blood, Mrs. Renfrew. He hid it all these years, waiting, and I think you're the one he was waiting for." Mabel Renfrew took the letters as though they might dissolve at a touch, held them to her breast, and the tears ran down her face without a sound. And for a long moment no one spoke, the lamp guttering, the cold air pouring past them into the warm room. Then she looked up, and past her grief something else was rising now, a slow understanding of what her midnight callers had truly brought. You didn't ride out here at midnight in the snow to bring a woman her grandfather's letters, she said, gently shrewd. There's more. Tell me the rest. So they told her, in the warm lamplit cabin, with her husband, roused and blinking by the fire, wrapped in a quilt, listening. They told her of the deed and the seal, of Silas Thorne and his forged tax title, of the assessor's certificate that swore there was no heir, of the county board that would meet in the morning to hand the Vance ground to a thief unless someone of the blood stood up to stop it. And they watched the woman's grief harden, slowly, into something else, into the flint her grandfather had cut his instructions with. The same stubborn refusal to let a well-built thing be torn down that had held that cabin roof through every storm the mountains sent. So this Thorne says there's no heir. Mabel Renfrew wiped her face with the back of one hand and sat up very straight in her chair, and the weariness fell off her voice. He says the last of the Vances went into the dark and left the ground for the taking. He says that in his fine papers, does he? Her chin came up. Then tomorrow I'll go to this board of his and I'll stand up in front of the whole county and I'll tell them my mother's name and my grandfather's name. And I'll let this Silas Thorne look at the heir he swore did not exist. Her hand closed hard over the letters. A man may lie on paper, but he cannot lie a living woman out of her own grandfather's ground. Not while I have breath to say otherwise. They did not sleep that night. Pruitt drove back to town before dawn to ready the record and rouse the two board members he judged honest enough to want the truth. Winnie stayed with the Renfrews, and in the small hours, over the fire, Mabel told her the pieces the letters could not. How Eliza had come down off the mountain a grown woman after her parents were gone, grieving and alone, but carrying something unbreakable in her. How she had married Thomas Renfrew and made a life on the flat, and how she had raised her own daughter on the story of the spring and the wagon and the father who had loved a foundling as his own blood. She never forgot she was left, Mabel said, gazing into the coals. She told me once that being left teaches you a thing nobody else learns, which is that a person's worth was never in the leaving. It was in whether one soul, just one, chose to turn back for you. She looked across the fire at Winnie, at the girl who had come out of a storm carrying a dead man's trust, and something passed between them that needed no naming. My mother would have known you, she said softly. The moment she laid eyes on you, she'd have known exactly what you were, and she'd have set a place for you at her table without asking a single question. The county board met at 10 in the morning in the long back room of the assay office, the only room in Red Willow large enough to hold the county's business. And it filled to the walls, because word had gone through the town like fire that the foundling girl meant to stand against Silas Thorne over ground in the mountains, and a small town starved for spectacle will turn out for that in any weather. Winnie sat at the front on a hard bench beside Pruitt, the deed in its oilcloth on the table before them, and she felt the eyes of the whole county on her back, the murmur of them, the weight of every judgment she had lived under her whole life, gathered into one room. Across the aisle, Silas Thorne sat easy and unhurried, a lawyer at his side in a good black coat, his brother behind him, papers squared before them. And he did not so much as glance at her, which was its own kind of message. To him, she was already beaten. To him, this was a formality, the last motion of a thing already decided. The three men of the board took their places, and the chairman, a heavy rancher named Doggett, with a fair reputation and a tired face, called the matter the petition of the land company, represented by Mr. Silas Thorne, for a tax title upon the lapsed Vance claim in the Silvercrest range. Thorne's lawyer rose first and laid it out smooth as poured cream. The delinquent taxes, the long-dead holder, the assessor's sworn certificate that no heir existed, the plain public interest in ground put back to use rather than left to rot. He spoke for a quarter hour and made it sound not merely legal but virtuous, a service to the county. And when he sat there was a murmur of agreement through the crowded room, because he had told them a story that flattered their sense of order. In Destiny denounced, in which industrious men rescued waste ground from the dead hand of the past. Then Pruitt rose, and the room quieted, because the recorder was known and trusted. He stated, in his dry, careful way, that 2 nights past a document had been presented to his office and entered into the county record, a document bearing directly on the matter before the board, and that if the board would permit, he would place it into evidence. He lifted the deed from its oilcloth and carried it to the board's table and laid it before the 3 men, the great sheet with its crowded script and its raised federal seal, and he explained plainly what it was. A patent, proved up, signed, sealed under the General Land Office for the very ground the petition sought to sell for taxes. Land that had never lapsed, never reverted, never been the county's to tax or sell, because it had belonged, free and clear, to Ezra Vance and his heirs from the day the seal was pressed. The murmur that went through the room now had a different note in it. Doggett bent over the deed with the other 2 board members, and Winnie watched the assessor's certain lie meet the government's own seal and begin to crumble in the meeting of them. But Thorne's lawyer was already on his feet, unhurried, smiling, and Winnie's brief hope tightened into dread, because this was the moment Pruitt had warned her of, the moment the truth would be called a lie by a man paid to call it so. A remarkable paper, the lawyer allowed, strolling toward the board's table with his hands behind his back. Truly, if it is genuine. But consider where it comes from, gentlemen. It was not found in a courthouse. It was not passed down through a family. It was produced 2 nights ago by this young woman, a person of no known family and no standing in this county, who claims, if I understand it, to have discovered it under the floor of an abandoned ruin, in a snowstorm, entirely alone, with no witness to the finding but herself. He turned at last to look at Winnie, and his gaze was almost gentle, which made it worse. I intend the girl no cruelty, but the board must ask what it is asked to believe, that a genuine federal patent lay hidden for 40 years exactly where it was needed, and was found by a stranger who happens to have carried it straight into the public record the very week a lawful tax sale was pending. Or the simpler thing, that a clever forgery was produced to cloud a good title by a person who saw a chance and took it, and who took, I might add, a quantity of gold from that same cabin, which she has not seen fit to mention. A stir ran through the crowd. He spread his hands. I do not say the girl is wicked. I say she is alone and desperate and unwitnessed, and that the word of such a person cannot outweigh the sworn certificate of the county's own assessor. Where is the heir this patent would serve? There is none. There has never been one. The petitioner asks only what the law allows. Let the tax title be granted, and let this sad theater end. He sat, and the room sat with him, the tide turning back, Winnie's truth reduced once more to the word of a girl no one knew, and Doggett looked at the deed and then at Winnie with real regret in his tired face. A man who wanted to do right and had just been told, persuasively, that right and the girl were not on the same side. It's a hard thing, the chairman said heavily, but the man's not wrong about the difficulty. A paper's only as good as the hand that brings it, and we've no way to know. You have a way. Winnie was on her feet before she had decided to stand. Every eye in the room swung to her, and the old familiar terror rose, the terror of being looked at, being weighed, being found wanting, and she stood in it and did not sit back down. You keep saying there's no heir. You keep saying I'm alone, that there's no one behind me, that the last of the Vances went into the dark. You've built your whole case on there being no one left of that family in all the world. Her voice gathered as she spoke, steadying, hardening. But you never asked. You swore it on paper because it was easier than asking. So ask now. Ask this room, is there anyone here who is kin to Ezra Vance? And from the back of the crowded room, from the doorway where she had waited on Pruitt's arrangement. For exactly this moment, a gray-haired woman in her Sunday black began to make her way up the center aisle, and the crowd fell back on either side to let her pass, and Mabel Renfrew came to the front of the room with her grandfather's letters clutched in one hand and her chin held high. I am, she said, and her voice carried to every corner of the silent room. Eliza Vance was my mother. Ezra Vance was my grandfather. I was raised on the story of that spring and that cabin before this man was born." She turned and fixed Silas Thorne with a look that had a lifetime of iron in it. "You swore there was no heir. You put your name to it. Well, here I stand. Look at me, Mr. Thorne. Look at the heir you sold the county a lie about. My grandfather hid his deed from a thorn once before, and I have read these 2 nights past, in his own hand, exactly what your kind tried to take from him then." She lifted the letters. "It's all here. Written the year my mother turned 21. A man named Thorne who wanted the Vance bottomland and turned to forgery, and a friend in the land office when honest means would not serve, and drove my grandfather up a mountain to hide what was rightfully his. 40 years ago." Her eyes never left Silas Thorne's face, which had gone the color of tallow. "Your father, I think. And now you, and your brother behind you. The same hunger, the same lie, the same paper cooked up to steal what a better man built. It seems some families pass down their legacy, and some pass down their sins." The room had gone utterly still, and into that stillness, Doggett lifted the assessor's certificate, the sworn paper that said no heir existed, and looked from it to the living heirs standing before him. And Winnie watched the chairman's tired face turn from regret to something harder, and turn slowly towards Silas Thorne. "This certificate is sworn," Doggett said, and his voice had changed, gone flat and dangerous. "Sworn and sealed that there was no heir of record, and here's a daughter of the blood standing in my meeting with the man's own letters in her hand." He set the certificate down as though it had soiled his fingers. "Either your assessor is a fool who couldn't be troubled to open the old marriage books that sit in this very building, or he swore to a thing he knew was false because he was paid to swear it. I'd like to know which, Mr. Thorne, and I expect before this is done I will." Thorne's lawyer began to rise, some smooth objection already shaping on his lips, but the room had turned, and he felt it turn, and the words died half-formed. Silas Thorne himself sat very still, and Winnie watched the calm slide off him like snow off a warming roof, watched the practiced ease give way to the naked calculation beneath. A man he sent totting up in an instant how much of his scheme could still be saved, and arriving, visibly, at very little. He rose without waiting to be recognized, buttoning his coat. "This board," he said, and his voice had lost its poured cream smoothness, "is not competent to weigh questions of forgery and fraud. I'll take this matter to the territorial court, where cooler heads. You'll take nothing anywhere just yet." Doggett nodded to the 2 other board members, and to the county sheriff who had come in at the back when the crowd did, a lean, watchful man who had been listening to all of it with his arms folded. "A woman sworn her grandfather's ground was stole by fraud, and she's got the papers to argue it. And there's a false oath sworn in a county office that somebody's going to answer for. That's not a thing a man walks away from because he's decided he'd rather be elsewhere. You'll stay in this town, Mr. Thorne, you and your brother both, until the territorial court has looked at every scrap of this. Or you'll answer to the sheriff for why you didn't. It did not happen all at once. The way a storm does not end all at once, but leaves off its fury and settles into a long gray clearing. There was no single hammer stroke of justice, only the slow grinding turn of the thing Ezra had set in motion 40 years before, the wheel he had trusted to whoever came. The territorial court took the matter up through the deep of that winter. Thorne's lawyer fought it the way such men fight, with motions and delays and fine distinctions. But the deed was genuine, and the seal was the government's own, and the assessor, faced with a charge of false swearing that could cost him his liberty, discovered a sudden fond memory of the fee Silas Thorne had pressed into his hand to look no further than he was told. Once one man had spoken, the rest came apart. The tax title scheme, it emerged, had not been Thorne's first. There were other claims, other lonely parcels whose owners had died or drifted, other old paper made to vanish so that new paper could be sold. The Vance claim, which Thorne had taken for the easiest of his thefts, ground with no one left to defend it, became instead the thread that unraveled the whole cloth. By spring, he faced not one charge but a ledger of them, and the fortune he had built on other people's forgotten ground was bound up in court writs and forfeitures and the fees of lawyers who no longer smiled when They saw him coming. Winnie was called to testify, and she stood up in the territorial court in her mended brown calico and told the plain truth of it, the storm and the cabin and the letters and the deed. And though Thorne's lawyer tried to make her out a thief and a schemer, he found he could not, because a foundling who has been underestimated her whole life has learned to sit very still under contempt and let it break itself against her. And there was gold. The lawyer reminded the court. Gold she had taken from that cabin and hidden. Winnie did not deny it. She had brought the pouch with her, every coin, and she set it on the clerk's table and said that it had to Ezra Vance, and that he had left it for his blood, and that she had carried it down a mountain and up out of a creek by 2 fingers, not because she wanted it, but because a dead man had trusted her to see it home, and that it belonged now to Mabel Renfrew, and to no one else, least of all to her. The keeping of a trust, she told the court, was not the same as the taking of a prize, and the difference between them was the whole difference between an honest woman and a thief. And she knew which one she was, even if the gentleman with the papers did not. It was not a speech she had prepared. It came out of her the way the truth comes out of people who have nothing left to protect but the truth itself. And the room was quiet when she finished. And the gold went to Mabel Renfrew, and the matter of Winifred Sutton the thief was heard of no more. The ground came back to the Renfrews whole, the whole of the Vance claim, the hollow in the spring and the cabin built from a wagon, restored to the blood of the man who had proved it up, and Mabel Renfrew, who had spent a long life on the flat, never knowing there was a mountain that belonged to her, did a thing that Winnie did not expect, and could not at first take in. She came to the boarding house one gray afternoon at the tail of winter, climbed the narrow stair to the attic room, and sat down on the edge of the thin cot, and took Winnie's needle-scared hands in her own. "I've been thinking on what my grandfather wrote," she said. "That last letter, the one to whoever came. He wrote that his true legacy wasn't the gold, nor the ground. It was the warmth he left in a cold place for a stranger." Her thumbs moved over Winnie's knuckles, over the small hard calluses of a life spent mending. "Well, you're the stranger, child. You're the one the storm drove to his door. He left that fire laid ready in the stove for 40 years, waiting for someone like you to come in out of the dark and light it. And you did. And you could have kept what you found. You could have sold that deed to Thorne and walked off $200 richer. And no one alive would have known there was ever another way it might have gone. But you carried it to the one honest man in the county, at the risk of your life, for the sake of people you never met and never thought to be thanked by." Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady as her grandfather's writing. "My mother used to say that being left teaches you the worth of turning back. You turned back for us, Winnie, for a dead man and an old woman and a family that was nothing to you. That's not a thing I can pay for with gold, and I'm not going to insult you by trying." Winnie could not speak. The old fear rose in her, the reflexive flinch of a person who has learned that warmth offered is warmth about to be withdrawn. And she waited for the catch, the condition, the sensible reason the kindness would turn out to be a mistake. It did not come. "There's a cabin up on that mountain," Mabel went on, "that my grandfather built to last, and it stood empty 40 years because there was no one to live in it. And there's a spring behind it that's never once frozen, and ground all around it that's ours again because of you. Josiah and I are too old for the high country now, but it wants someone in it. It wants someone who knows the worth of a warm place in the cold, someone who will light that stove and keep it lit, and mend what the years have torn, and make it a home again instead of a memory." She squeezed the scarred hands in hers. "I'm asking you to be that someone, not as charity, as kin. My mother would have claimed you the moment she saw you, and I claim you now in her place. Come and be a Renfrew or a Vance or a Sutton on Vance ground. I don't care which name you carry. Only come out of this cold little room and let there be, at last, one window in the world that you can call your own." They restored the cabin together over the following seasons. Winnie and the Renfrews, and the men Mabel hired from town. And it was Winnie who drove the work. Winnie who knew from her needle and thread the patience of joining what has come apart. Winnie, who read Ezra's carved instructions above the stove and understood them now not as a stranger's charity, but as a grandfather's welcome home. She cleared the east pipe before she slept the first night, as the wall had told her to. She learned which spruce caught quickest. She kept the low draft open when the storms came. And the storms came, and the roof held, the way it had always held, because a man had built it well the first time, so it need not be built twice. She pressed the wildflowers of that first mountain summer between the pages of the one book she owned, the way a girl named Eliza had done a lifetime before. And in the deep of the following winter she opened it, and found the summer waiting. She did not become rich in the way the mercantile stranger would have understood riches. The gold was Mabel's, and Winnie would not have taken it if it had been offered, which it was, and refused. What she took instead was the ground and the spring, and the well-built roof, and the slow, astonishing discovery that a person could be wanted, could be claimed, could be set a place at a table, and never once made to earn it by being useful. She learned that family was not, after all, the accident of blood, but the deliberate choice to turn back, made and remade across a lifetime, and, sometimes, across a century, by people who understood that the smallest warmth, left in a cold place, could travel further than its maker ever dreamed, far enough to reach a stranger, far enough to change a life, far enough to bring a girl who had been left in the snow all the way home at last. On the 14th of October the following year, Winnie climbed to the cabin alone with a small store of sugar she had been saving 3 months in secret. And she baked a little cake no bigger than her two hands together. And she set it on the worn bench by the stove, with a candle made from that summer's tallow, and she lit it. She did not do it for herself, though it was her birthday, her 22nd, the first she had ever marked. She did it for Eliza, the girl who had wept over just such a cake in just such a room a lifetime before. The girl whose story had reached across all the silent years to tell a foundling in a storm that her life had mattered, that a person's worth was never in the leaving, but in whether one's soul chose to turn back. Winnie sat in the firelight with the little flame burning, and the spring running sweet and cold behind the wall, as it had always run, never once frozen, never once failing, and she understood at last what Ezra Vance had meant, that the true inheritance was not the gold he hid, nor the ground he held, but the warmth he had left for a stranger he would never meet, and that she had found it, and that she would leave it burning now, for whoever might someday come in out of the dark and need it, the way she had needed it, the way she had been needed in return. Outside, the first snow of the new winter began to fall, soft and unhurried, settling over the mountain and the hollow and the well-built roof. And inside, for the first time in all her life, Winifred Sutton was exactly where she belonged, and knew it, and was not afraid.